Welcome back to our program. I'm your host, Rick Wu. We will continue our discussion on U.S., Taiwan, and cross-strait relations with four important guests from both the United States and Taiwan. I'm going to start off with Professor Goldstein. Steve, we understand that recent controversy has erupted between Taipei and Washington over the government's decision to lift the ban on certain parts of the U.S. beef products into Taiwan. And it is becoming a huge political issue within Taiwan itself. And how would you expect such a controversy impact the relations between Washington and Taipei in the coming months, if there's any?
Well, I think the people who are making policy towards Asia and towards Taiwan are very familiar with what's probably the first law of Taiwan's policy towards the outside world.
Yes.
And that is that it's largely determined by domestic politics.
Well, happens.
And
yes.
So I think that this kind of a flare-up, particularly on an issue which is potentially as emotional and as frightening
as food safety,
as food safety is, and given the nature of Taiwan politics, I don't think anyone's surprised that, that this should have happened. I think as far as the overall relationship,
yes,
I wouldn't expect that it would intrude that greatly into other parts of the relationship, particularly the defense relationship, which is considered to be very important. But I think that the government on Taiwan should be aware of two facts, and the first fact is that the United States also has domestic constituencies, and beef growers are one of them, and one of the more important. Secondly, that the whole concept of how Taiwan manages this is going to be an indication of how people in Washington view the government. I'm not going to make a judgment on how well this was managed, but I think that the indirect effect will be to shape the perception of the nature and competence of the present government.
Alan, anything more to add?
Well, the only thing I would add to that, I think that while food safety is always sensitive, including, of course, in the United States, that the U.S. government feels very strongly, and I think that the government here agrees, and other governments that have reached these kinds of agreement with the United States agree, that it's scientifically a sound agreement. And so while the fears are quite real and people have to take account of this, there's no question, I think that the sense of justification for this is one thing that will affect the kind of considerations that Steve raises about how people look at Taiwan and its ability to live up to agreements and so on and so forth in the future. But I also would strongly endorse the notion that in terms of overall relations, I don't think this is going to have
too much of a negative spillover.
Yeah, certainly on the security issue, despite charges to the contrary, I think that the Obama administration has been quite supportive of cross-strait policy and so on and so forth. So I don't think that's going to change.
Okay, good. And Bi-khim, we're going to start off with another very emotional issue, and it's always been very controversial in cross-strait relations, is regarding Taiwan's international space. And you being an active, opponent of, active proponent of Taiwan's greater expanded international space for many, many years, would you think that since the relaxation and the improvement of ties between Beijing and Taipei, that there's been expanded a more enlarged space for Taiwan internationally? Because I know you go to many international meetings and conferences. Has the treatment been improved, better, since May of 2008?
Well, there are different categories of our international space, and I have to say that on the area of our diplomatic relations, we have not seen a change or a downgrading of the numbers. And so, and these countries are important for Taiwan, and if the relaxing cross-strait mood does help to facilitate our maintaining those ties, then we should give some credit to progress in that area. However, in many other areas that are important to Taiwan, we see China continuing their very aggressive campaign to isolate Taiwan. And I want to give you an example that is in the recent APEC summit, where former Vice President Lian Zhan attended the summit on behalf of Taiwan. And Lian Zhan, I think all political analysts here in Taiwan would consider him one of China's best friends. Yet even for someone like him as a good friend of China, during this summit, he was excluded from a very critical meeting related to climate change, where all of the other summit participants were invited. He was the only one who was left out of it. And so obviously, being a good friend of China does not always help. It doesn't necessarily help our participation and international space in that context. Furthermore, at the recent Copenhagen meeting, and we all know our government again was excluded from taking place in the intergovernmental mechanism. Our NGOs were allowed to take place, but only under the name of China, and that we also found very offensive and problematic. In other UN-related NGO bodies, in the past decade or so, we've had women, labor groups, Aborigine groups attending NGO meetings, as long as they're affiliated with some other international accredited NGO organization. However, over the past 2 years, China has even blocked our NGOs. Anyone carrying a Taiwan passport is not allowed to attend a UN-related NGO meeting. And this kind of aggressive offense against our participation continues. And there are many, many more examples like this. I think all of the Taiwanese citizens who attend international meetings, attend conferences or competitions, will understand that it is always a struggle, and it continues to be a struggle. And so I really don't see the pressure really relaxing on that end.
Deputy Minister Chao, again, in your private capacity as an academic, that can you share with us that do you expect, in spite of the improvement of the relations between Beijing and Taipei, do you expect more goodwill gestures coming out of Beijing regarding Taiwan's international space? For example, do you expect that we'll be invited again to the WHA, the World Health Assembly, this year in May?
Well, last year we achieved a lot in terms of broadening our international space. For the very first time in nearly 4 decades, Taiwan was able to participate in activities sponsored by UN affiliated organizations. This is very important and significant. And Bi-khim mentioned the former Vice President Dr. Lian Zhan. He also went to the APEC meeting as our chief
presidential envoy
representative for the very first time since the founding of since our inclusion in the organization in 1992, if I'm not mistaken. The previous government, DPP government, tried to send our another former Vice President, Dr. Li Yuanchu, to Beijing APEC meeting, but failed. So this is yet another evidence to prove that the
level of participation.
Yes, the close linkage between our international space and the cross-strait relations. In other words, better relations with mainland China can and have already been helping with our expansion of our international space. Talking about this year, of course, the international climate change is very important. We cannot afford to be not included, to be excluded. So my government has made the membership of the UNFCCC, UN Conference on Climate Change, a priority. So hopefully we will be able to gain an observer status this year. This is way too important for us to be missed in.
Okay.
Another important international organization is International Organization for Civil Aviation. We also like to be a member. This year, so we have singled out these two important international organizations as a possible target. Hopefully we can get there.
Okay, all right. We're now coming to the end of the first hour of our discussion on U.S.-Taiwan and cross-strait relations. I don't know about you, but I certainly haven't had enough with these, panel of distinguished, special guests to our program today. So we will continue with the part 2, the second hour of our discussion next week on our program. I'll see you next time on MacroView Television. Thank you for watching.